Opening the diagonal for the queen and bishop immediately stakes a claim in the center, setting the stage for rapid development and potential early aggression. Instantly establishing asymmetrical pawn tension, Sicilian defense aims to deny white the central space advantage and ignite a dynamic battle. Developing knights early often aims to control central squares and prepare for castling, setting up an active middle game. Solidifying the pawn structure and preparing for central pawn challenges. Opening the center immediately, white challenges black's pawn structure and seeks a dynamic game. Opening the center this way immediately challenges white's central pawn and prepares for active piece play across the board. Instantly seizing central influence, this recapture ignites the Sicilian battle. Developing the knight to its most active square, this challenge to the central pawn immediately ignites the Sicilian tension. Asserting central presence, this knight solidifies control over key squares while preparing for further development, setting the stage for dynamic play. Developing this knight further solidifies the pawn structure and prepares for potential pawn pushes in the center. This bishop's sortie immediately pins the knight, generating pressure on black's queenside structure and setting up future attacking possibilities. Preparing to liberate the queenside bishop, black subtly shifts the pawn structure to open new avenues. Securing the bishop's defense and preparing for kingside castling is the immediate goal, though it does commit the queen somewhat early. Developing the bishop to this square solidifies the kingside pawn structure and prepares for castling, a crucial defensive maneuver. Embracing the open c-file, the king's departure from the center initiates a dynamic kingside attack, often leading to sharp play. Castling kingside now solidifies the monarch, creating a unified pawn shield and preparing to join the central battle. Navigating the knight to safety, this repositioning aims to support a central pawn push later and avoid immediate pressure. A preemptive strike to secure the queenside, while subtly inviting a pawn storm or preparing a queenside expansion of its own. Sacrificing the bishop opens crucial lines for attack, but creates doubled pawns for black, altering the pawn structure significantly. Accepting the doubled pawns weakens your king's shelter, but opens the g-file for counterplay. Aggressively targeting black's kingside pawn structure, white seeks to exploit the weakened diagonal and create attacking chances. Seeking dynamic counterplay on the queenside, black embarks on an ambitious pawn thrust to disrupt white's king safety aspirations. Opening up that kingside for attack is bold, but leaves your own monarch exposed. Bouldering up the queenside, black immediately challenges white's pawn structure and opens a diagonal for their bishop, aiming to disrupt white's castled position. Securing the knight with a defensive post, but sacrificing pawn structure integrity for it. Opening the queenside flank, black aims to disrupt white's kingside castle and create counterplay. Challenging black's pawn chain directly, white aims to exploit the open g-file and create attacking chances against the enemy king. Black's knight dances into the center, challenging white's pawn structure and opening lines for potential counterplay. Injecting immediate kingside danger, this pawn thrust aims to rip open lines and exploit black's slightly awkward pawn structure on that wing. Pushing the pawn aggressively opens a new dimension, daring white's king to defend its advanced pawns. Unlocking potential, this knight repositions to control key central squares and prepare for a pawn storm's advance. Unleashing a bold pawn storm, black disrupts white's queenside structure and aims to pry open lines for attack. Opening the a-file now allows for active piece play, challenging black's pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, black sacrifices material for dynamic counterplay and open lines. Reclaiming the pawn opens a critical diagonal for your queen and intensifies pressure along the file. Exposing your king to the open files for a pawn breaks the symmetry and creates critical defensive challenges. Opening the h-file creates immediate attacking possibilities against black's castled king, forcing a reaction. Suddenly a tactical bolt, the knight lands, threatening discovered attacks and disrupting white's pawn structure with immense force. unleashing the queen to pressure the kingside and create new mating threats. Unleashing the bishop suddenly exposes white's castled king to a sharp tactical storm. Watch for the king's escape routes closing. Securing the king's escape route becomes paramount as the central pawns are shattered, offering vital prophylaxis against immediate threats. Opening the H-file offers a sharp tactical gamble against the white king. Simplifying into a favorable endgame, white unloads pressure by forcing the queen exchange, aiming to exploit the open files. Exchanging the bishop clarifies the pawn structure, preparing to attack white's somewhat exposed king. Focusing development on the king's side and aiming to activate the bishop for a potential queenside initiative. A tactical retreat, aiming to reposition the knight for an assault on white's kingside pawn structure. Opening the e-file immediately challenges the knight and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure before it solidifies. A bold thrust, directly confronting the weakened white king's defense and aiming for a promising piece exchange. Decisive capture opens lines and exploits the doubled pawn's weakness, aiming for a swift attack. Chasing the knight deep into enemy territory now risks isolation and a weakened pawn structure. Opening the d-file suddenly threatens a rook invasion and pressures black's isolated pawns, creating immediate tactical headaches. Unveiling the b-file bishop subtly threatens to unravel white's queenside pawn structure. Asserting dominance on the open file, this maneuver aims to pry open the kingside further. Seeking refuge and counterplay, the knight bravely ventures towards the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces. Securing the b-file with this rook exchange aims to disrupt black's coordination and potentially exploit imbalances. Probing the weak back rank with the bishop, hoping to stir up trouble on the kingside. Clearing the path for your rook to become dominant on the open c-file. Pushing the rook to the open file immediately contests white's central pawn majority and prepares for pawn breakthroughs. Unlocking the b-file opens crucial attacking potential against black's underdeveloped queenside. Aims to seize the open, a file potentially creating threats against white's queenside pawns. Controlling the open file with the rook is essential for creating pressure against black's potentially exposed pieces. A bold capture, opening the rank for your rooks and preparing to challenge the weakened kingside pawns. Seizing the open c-file with the rook drastically improves its activity and pressure on black's queenside. The knight's daring leap to e5 reclaims an attacking presence, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially pressure the king. Pawn push ignites a race to promotion, aiming to overwhelm black's defense. Harnessing the open file, this knight repositions to exploit white's vulnerable king and potentially create mating threats. Aggressively repositioning the knight to eye the vulnerable kingside, though it surrenders some central presence. Creating a pawn chain anchors the kingside structure, aiming to restrict white's knight and perhaps prepare a future kingside expansion. A bold pawn push now creates a dangerous pass threat, forcing black to react to its relentless advance toward the 7th rank. A crucial moment to solidify pawn structure and prepare for an active rook. This relocation of the rook to the 7th rank intensifies pressure, threatening both the pinned knight and the entire black position. Pushing the pawn creates immediate pressure on white's scattered pieces and opens a path for the rook. Asserting control over the c-file with this rook advances the plan to create an unstoppable passed pawn. Bringing the king into the game offers a sliver of counterplay, but it remains precariously exposed to the rooks. Sacrificing the rook for a pawn forces a crucial endgame trade, aiming to exploit white's exposed king. Safeguarding the king's precarious position takes precedence over any further complications or pawn advances. The rook's advance here initiates a dangerous pressure campaign along the 7th rank. The knight's retreat to f6 aims to rejoin the queenside defense, but it leaves the e-pawn vulnerable and misses an opportunity to contest the d-file. Simplifying the position now brings your knight to a more active role, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure. The king's journey across the board continues, seeking any outpost that offers respite from the open files. Unleashing a checking blitzkrieg, the knight carves a path to disrupt the Black King's sanctuary. The Black King, suddenly thrust into the fray, now faces a critical decision: to retreat or to continue its audacious centralizing maneuver. Unleashing a tempo-gaining check to drive the enemy king further into the open, aiming to capitalize on its exposed position.